there, I'm Bellisons, and today I am not making custom content for The Sims 4. I do spend most of my time doing custom content and I find it fun and I enjoy it, but I do want to branch out into doing Vtuber and character content as well, even though it's only going to be a small portion of the channel. I'm going to be honest, I've been on and off editing this video for quite a while now. The Vtuber model itself I started working on mid-April 2022, and I worked on it quite intensively, took a short procrastination break, and then I returned to finish it just before the end of June. And now here we are in January 2023, and I'm finally getting around to finishing the editing. Hopefully. If you're watching this in January 2023, that means I succeeded. If you can't tell just yet who I'm making, it's not an original character or a character that I'm ever going to use for myself personally. You see, I'm not a creative person in the same way that some other people are creative. Even with my custom content, I can look at something that someone else has made or just something else that exists and do a pretty decent job in translating and copying that into a 3D medium. But in terms of coming up with my own original ideas and original characters and designs, it's just not really my strongest suit. Everyone has their strengths and weaknesses, and that just so happens to be one of mine. So I'm recreating Jinx from Arcane as a way of still being able to practice skills and techniques and procedures in practice, even if, because of copyright and intellectual property and such, she won't be used as an avatar in streams or in videos. But let me change into something a little bit more comfortable. There we go, a sneak peek of the final product while I talk for the next, half an hour or so. And on that note, this is, as you can tell by now, a time-lapse video of the creation process from start to almost finish. It's not a walkthrough step by step, it's not a tutorial, but if you learn something either by watching what I'm doing or listening to what I have to say about it, then great. In general, I am still new to the process, so I only kind of know what I'm doing. In saying that, whenever I say that this is only the third Vroid model that I've made, people assume that I don't have any skills whatsoever and I'm just good at this so easily. Not trying to say that, oh, I'm really good at this, but I do have years of 3D modeling experience in creating 3D characters and rigs, that this is pretty much just the same process, just a little bit different in terms of getting them to work as a Vroid and learning some different programs and such. I'm not completely in the deep end here, but some people don't seem to get that part and just expect me to be able to tell you exactly what to do to get the exact same results that I have. Anyway, now that that's out of the way, let's get more into the actual video. I started out my process in Vroid Studio to form a base to work onto later. I'm focusing more on the facial features and the proportions here, but I do still adjust some of the features a lot later and it's not too big of a deal. Just getting them as close as I can for now is better. I'm also doing the texturing for these features in Vroid Studio. The majority of the eyes, though I did move over to Photoshop to fix up some things a little bit easier than I can in Vroid Studio. The eyebrows, the face texture, all of that fun stuff. I do really like the style of Arcane, so I'm trying to pivot this model away from being the very anime style and something a little bit more unique. The nose looks really wonky right now as well, and I know that, but I do have a plan for it. I'm just focusing on the texture, and I'll let the actual shape of the nose mesh to fit better later. I'm also paying attention to her asymmetrical features like her eyebrows, because even something as simple as that makes it feel a little bit more organic and less symmetrical. That's just my opinion anyway. Once I'm happy with how the face is looking, I'm moving on to the body, and I'm just matching the shading as close as possible to the face. It kind of sucks that they are separated in the program, so it's harder to get them to match up exactly, but I think I did an okay job. I'm just focusing on the foundation details of the body and muscles and shading and such, and her tattoos I will actually add that in at a later time. I'm much more comfortable working with the tools in Blender and I know that I'll get a better result that way. Also, it's probably worth noting that at this point, while the time-lapse is ahead a little bit and I'm already in Blender in the background, I'm still talking about Vroid Studio. It's a great program if you want to dip your toes into this kind of thing. I feel like there is a lot that you can do just within Vroid Studio itself. Kind of think of it as a customizable anime human Vroid. It's a good foundation or a starting point. You can do a lot in it, but at the same time, it can be a little bit limiting, in which case you'll want to look into other ways of either expanding on it or just ditching the program entirely. Kind of like what I did. Anyway, let's export the base out for now, as that's all that I wish to do in Vroid Studio, and the rest of the process will in fact be in Blender. I'm sure if I tried to master it a bit better, I could get a good hairstyle going in Vroid Studio, but again, I'm more comfortable with Blender and I want to just do it the way that I've got in my head. Also on that note, I get the question a lot of how to export and import between the different programs. Exporting from Vroid Studio is easy, but to import it into Blender, you need a plugin called the Cats plugin. If I remember, I'll have a link below, otherwise you can just search Cats Blender plugin and follow their documentation. In Blender, the first thing that I'm doing is fixing up some of the proportions of the body, and I'll revisit and adjust the features little by little throughout the entire process, which you will see. With the skin texture, because I was working in grayscale in Vroid Studio with the colors mapped to the highlights, midtones, and shadows, now those colors are applied and I can add in even darker and lighter colors, and overall just a bit more detail than before. This is where I fix up the nose to be less anime style and a bit more of a realistic westernized shape. Onto the clothing now that I've got a good base to start with, and mainly because I am procrastinating her hair at this point. I know it's such a defining feature for her, but I'm still not 100% sure on how I'm going to go about it. I have a few ideas in mind in terms of the process to take and the tools that I'll use, but instead I'm just going to sweep that problem under the rug and work on something else until I either figure something out or I have nothing left to procrastinate about and I'm forced to do it. Anyway, the method for the clothes is to take a plane and use a shrink wrap modifier combined with the face snapping tool to create the shape of the clothing onto the body itself. And I also use this method for most of my custom content, so you've probably seen this before. I mainly focus on the outer details that will form the main shape. Let me explain this better. By starting off with the silhouette outlines like the bottom edge, the neckline, the armholes, I have a foundation to work from to then just pretty much just fill in the rest. And it's also good to form these important loops in terms of topology. It just keeps things a lot neater and easier to work with. I leave open 4 holes in the front of the shirt, which will be the metal eyelets. Another feature I think is quite unique and defining for Jinx. I need to apply at least my subdivision surface modifier in order to continue to add in more detail, and I use this so that way I get more detail for less work. For example, the eyelets now don't have enough detail in them and I don't like how flat-sided they are, so I just cut in some extra vertices pretty easy. At this point, I'm already working out of mirror mode 2. Maybe I should have kept it on a little bit longer, especially to fix up the shape of the eyelets as they are in fact symmetrical, but her top itself has a lot of non-symmetrical detail in it that I had just already started doing anyways. The straps around the collar are just a tedious process of looking at as many reference images as I can find and looping them around. Riot is actually pretty good in terms of having the turnaround for their characters over on ArtStation. If you couldn't tell by now, accuracy is a really important thing to me, so of course I try and match them up exactly. I've had to cut out so many little pauses where I'm looking at the references on my other screen, studying the details and just going backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. At this point, I'm now applying my shrink wrap modifier because all of the basic details are in place and I want to start adding some 3D details and adjusting the clothing away from the body a bit, like overlapping the parts of the collar straps. I probably could have done this model just as a waist up model like a lot of VTubers are because that's only what's ever seen on a screen, but I wake up every day and I choose violence for myself. So I'm making sure all of the details on the back, like those rings and how they attach to the straps, all of the details down to the bolts on the shoes are all the same. You may notice as well that I pivot around and zoom out a lot. It just helps me see the project as a whole and so that I'm not zoomed too far in all the time focusing on the small details. It's why I also just go around to different parts of the model. If I'm ever stuck on something or I finish a certain element, by zooming out I can just see what sticks out to me as needing fixing or what to work on next. I'm sorry if it's just a bit disorientating or flashing. This whole video is sped up 15 times and That's quite fast, I think, without being too fast that you can't tell what's even happening. And if you haven't figured out by now how long this video is times 15 plus all the bits that I cut out, this project was quite a long one. And unlike the Shanling video that I did previously where I hyper focused on it and started and finished it within like a week by working on it 9 hours a day, this model for Jinx, you already know I procrastinated a bit and I've been busy catching up on other projects, mainly custom content, that I only get the time to be working on this on and off. Regardless, I spent a little over 23 hours actively working on her model from the moment I opened Vroid Studio to the moment that I finished all of her modeling and texturing. That's not including the rigging time, time spent in Unity, blend shapes, and everything else like that. The last parts though, I'm not as confident in, so they took longer than they probably would have if I had some more practice and knew exactly what I was doing, like I do with the modeling and texturing. That was quite a little bit of rambling, but I do just want to mention that this model is where I started experimenting with face blend shapes so that way I can get some really nice tracking, like with the eyes, the eyebrows, mouth corners and such. I don't have my webcam active right now, so it's not tracking my gaze, and the tracking is, also I've heard, a lot better with iPhones than Android, but I can do some cool things with my face. For this project, I'm working on modeling all of the bits and pieces first, then unwrapping everything as a whole and texturing it all on one texture. Sounds silly and obvious, but if you saw the last Vroid model where I made Shanling from Genshin Impact, then you know that I have learned from my mistakes. Rather than using a shrink wrap method to create the gloves over the body mesh, I want to use the body to extrude it out from. I figured that would be a lot neater. But this body mesh is made out of triangles and kind of difficult to work with for now, so converting it to quads makes it easier when working with edge loops and extruding and adding details and everything else I need to do with the gloves. I did start out with doing this manually so that I had more control over it, but after that got tedious, it turns out the automatic way of converting tris to quads actually works out pretty well. A lot of the detail for the gloves is going to be in the texture anyway, especially since I don't have hand tracking, so it's not going to be quite so much of a main feature. Like, I'm barely even showing off the gloves right now, so in saying that, I do still want to have some detail in there in whatever case that I need it for, so I add in some little folds and creases and variation in the heights, the different fabric layers and such. Time to move on to the pants, and there's actually quite a lot of individual little pieces and details for these. I start off with creating the belt and all of the details in it. There's like this overlapping padded like piece on the left side of her hip. It reminds me of like those padded laptop bags that have the bit of the padded shoulder piece that goes over the main strap. Anyway, I wanted to get the shape and the detail of that just right as well. Definitely could have made it a lot simpler, but here we are. Moving on to the main structure of the pants, I started off in symmetry, just like the top, to get at least the base mesh constructed. Then I applied this and then add in all of the unique asymmetrical details, because it sits up higher on one side than the other especially. For the overlapping piece on her right side, I hide out the top couple of loops of faces, then adjust the border between them so that I can adjust the main structure of the pants and get that sharp edge without affecting the pieces that I've hidden. If that makes sense. It makes sense to me, and I think it's a useful tip and something that I do quite a bit as needed. I like using proportional editing, but if there's something that I don't want to be affected, I can just hide it and not have it be affected. See, this is why I say I don't do tutorials. I'm not the greatest at explaining things, but I'm trying my best because I do like to help people and share the things that I've learned in whichever way that I can. I'm making the hanging overall strap parts out of curves to get a nice smooth shape, and then just converting them to a mesh and adjusting them as needed. Creating the point that they loop onto the belt, that kind of stuff. I like the little metal chevron details on them for some reason, I just think they're neat. They also aren't even on both sides, so I apply a mirror modifier and then fix them up to add some variety. Now, I don't have a lot else to say right now, but it's only a short time before I do have something to say about what I'm doing. So until then, let me just show off the finished product of the details that I am working on right now. Specifically like the midsection here that again goes underappreciated because you don't see it that often. The cuff of the pants I'm trying to match as close as possible to my references, that's why there's lots of small pauses. Of course it isn't going to be exact and it's lots of tiny small details, but I still think it at least gets the general point across. I probably also didn't have to be as exact, I could have just simplified or stylized it and it would have looked the same because no one's gonna look that close. Oh boy, now we're on to the shoes. This is definitely a trust the process kind of thing. They look very bulbous and puffy in the beginning, but I do eventually tame the shape of them into being something that looks decent. I don't really have a specific method. I use a cylinder to get the bulk shape down, and then I guess I just do the main outline of the important areas. The top that forms the side profile that goes all the way up and forms the lower layer that sits behind the shoelaces. I can't stress how important references are and really studying the shape. From looking at pictures, I could tell that there was two main parts to the shoe. The back part that comes in and forms a shape that goes towards the toes down and then scoots back towards the heel, and then the front piece is underneath this back piece. I don't actually make any overlapping, I just have a loop of faces that joins these two pieces up into the laces section. I'm trying my best to explain here. Hopefully it makes sense as you're watching it alongside me talking. I ended up spending quite a lot of time just on the shoes, partially because the next step to work on was the hair and surprise surprise, I'm still procrastinating that. But also, the shoes are just something that I did get caught up in all of the details for. I don't think that this is in a bad way. I just had a lot of fun recreating all the little bits and pieces, and just in general, I think shoes are quite a complex piece. I don't know, I just had fun and I really like the end result of them. For the eyelets, I'm not making them part of the base mesh because that just seems like too much effort. So they're just going to sit on top and I'll just paint them black underneath to make them look like holes. Pro tip, unwrap an object first if you plan to be duplicating it even once or twice. I've got 36 eyelets in here in the end, I'm pretty sure, and I'm 100% not going to be painting them individually or unwrapping them individually. Just make one, unwrap it first, it'll save you a shit ton of time down the track. The laces, on the other hand, very tedious. I tried making them as a mesh object to start with by using a plane, and that idea was very quickly scrapped and edited out. I then opted for curves, which were a little bit more fiddly. I just really roughly put in the points for where they go into each eyelet and then added some extra points to make them weave in and out. I'm going to admit that I spent a lot of time here perfecting the path, especially for the knots at the end of the laces. I'm kind of really proud of them. But for the shape itself, I did not make them circular, but instead have a flat shape to them. It does mean that the angle of the flat bit kept rotating. Another pro tip, Control T will rotate the angle of the curve without actually changing the position or affecting any of the other points. So, as I said, I spent a lot of time on the shoes here, a lot of time for something that won't even be seen in the end. So here's a look at the end result anyways. Let's just go down here. There's lots of little individual details, and honestly, I could have just not made shoes, but they were so fun to work on. And the extra bones that I added into the laces and the flappy bits, and so that way they sway when they're moving, I just love them. But this is also the reason why in the future I'll be offering option of half, 3/4 and full Vtuber models, because for the most part the lower half isn't even needed, especially in the standard Vtuber stream setting. They are probably my favorite part that is going to be so underappreciated, but now that you've had time to appreciate them too, let's move on. Alright, so there's no avoiding it now. I've spent enough time on the shoes leading up to it, so now we start on the hair. Finally. What you don't see is the first few attempts of me figuring out how to go about making the structure of the hair itself. I tried out a method with curves, I didn't like it too much. I tried out using a mesh, and that was just very difficult to work with. So I went back to curves and I just wanted to try out using another curve that controls the actual bevel. They call it bevel, but it's like the shape, the cross section of each of the strands of hair, and it makes it look like as if they were multiple smaller strands of hair grouped together. Then using another curve to control the taper, and that way it's thicker at the base and then thinner at the end. And from here it's just lots of tweaking and adjusting to get it looking right. I start out with the main biggest strands of hair, and then once those are sorted, I put in some smaller strands as well to fill in the gaps and add in a bit more detail. This is another point where I'm frequently zooming in and out and seeing if anything stands out to me as needing adjusting, zooming back in, reassessing. I'm all over the place. This is really the first time that I have made such a unique and complex hairstyle using curves, so there's a lot of me messing around while I try and figure out what to do, and you'll see me have to go back on something sometimes and fix them up. For the main body of hair, which basically just isn't the fringe, I took a page out of Vroid Studio's book. That is to say, I wanted it to still have that Vroid character look and the same charm, I guess. So for the rest of the hair, I did use a mesh to cover the head, the same way that Vroid Studio hair is constructed basically, but I just did it manually. I added in some main strands around the head as a guide and then just filled in the gaps, rather than starting all at one point and working my way around. It keeps them looking neat and not so warped by the time I get to the other side. I left most of them unfinished at the ends because this is where I'm going to attach the plaits to later. And I also get really picky about the clipping and just making sure that all of the different hair pieces overlap nicely and such. I did get a little bit lazy when it comes to the plaits because I just took the plaits that I made for Xianling and copied them over. I didn't want to make plaits again pretty much. I just wasn't happy with how the originals were 2D. It worked for the Xianling model, but I wanted to take this opportunity and make them more 3D. I did also add a little bit of extra detail to the curves of the plaits so that they were a bit smoother, basically because the plaits here are going to be bigger and they just need more detail to not look so low poly. The last detail that I added in was some little strands sticking out from the plait. For now they are one-sided, but after the rigging and everything is done, then I'll duplicate them so that way can be seen from the back side as well. Because remember, faces are all technically one-sided, it's just Blender that does render them two sides. I made some long curves to form the main shape of the plaits, from about the base of the head all the way down. This way I can take some of the unfinished strands from earlier and then join them to the top of the plait so that way it's all nice and connected and works as if it would in real life. For the remaining strands that aren't directly connected, I weave them in and around so that way they look like little stray strands sticking out. I put a lot of effort into not making the hair so symmetrical so that way it looks a bit more organic, and that's very important to me. And now that I'm happy with the main shape of the hair, I add in some extra detail on the skin itself, and it just helps blend it in a little bit better. For the main fringe strands, I convert these from curves to a mesh, that way I can refine them a bit further, and this is mainly just fine-tuning the shape and positioning and the overlap, as well as getting rid of a bunch of geometry that isn't needed and make it a bit lower poly and overall more optimized. All of the hair gets unwrapped onto the wont texture. Earlier I made a lot of the pieces, especially for the main base of the hair, overlap in texture so that way it's less work on me and I don't have to texture everything individually, but I'm going to be honest, I did not do it very well and I missed a lot of areas that I had to unwrap later after I had already started on the texture, and in the end it's just honestly kind of a mess. But it's fine, I'm the only one who knows about that, right? I didn't include me unwrapping all of the clothes and the shoes. It was very disorientating to watch because I move around a lot very quickly, and to speed that up was just terrible to look at. I don't really have any tips or advice for unwrapping because it's just very intuitive for me, but all of the clothing and shoe pieces as well as the hairbands and the gloves are all on one texture space. How Vroid Studio works is that each of the individual little pieces are all individual textures. For example, the eye highlights are all one texture, the iris is a second texture, the sclera is a third texture, eyelashes are a fourth texture, eyebrows are a fifth texture, so on and so on. And it works, it's fine, but it is a little bit tedious when doing work in Blender and then subsequently in Unity to have 20 different texture files and materials. So at least for my editions of the clothing, shoes, accessories, all of that stuff, I have them all on one texture, and then for future models, I will be doing a better job at condensing down all the Vroid textures as well. I was just a little bit lazy at this point because, like I said, it works, and I didn't really want to go to the effort of doing that right now. From this point onwards, I'm a little bit all over the place. You may find it odd that I'm going back and changing the shape of the face a lot, and I guess it kind of is. Like I said at the beginning, I had a lot of trouble nailing down her features, so I've been doing a lot of small changes here and there whenever I felt that something was off, but now is when I really noticed just how round and large her face was. I'm just going in and making it narrower, which meant that I had to fix up the hair and such as well, but that's okay. Her hair was a bit too puffy and round anyway, so now it's flatter and it looks a lot better, I think. But with that out of the way, I move on to texturing the entire outfit, which was quite a bit of work, I must say. I start at the top and work my way down, mostly because I was just getting a little burnt out at this point, and I figured if I really wanted to give up, at least I had a waist up model complete. I did stick with it to the end though, and I'm glad that I did, though I didn't get too far into the texturing before realizing I was being a bit too excited to start before I had fully finished the hair. The plaits themselves were a bit too loose, so I just had to go in and manually adjust them a bit tighter and not have any gaps showing through. But then I also forgot I hadn't even made the bands for her hair yet either. So I did that and just fit them into the gaps into the texture space for the clothing. Wasn't a big deal. And now we are actually officially onto the texturing. I just do it bit by bit. I start and finish the top before moving on to the left glove, then the right glove, etc. I don't have too much to say about the process, honestly. I'm trying to just follow the texture from the model used in Arcane and doing my best to mimic the hand-painted texture with all the lines and scuffs and scratches and such. For the metallic parts, I paint in a metallic-y texture, though in the end I do separate the texture out so that way I can put an actual shiny and reflective material on top of it as well. So lots of little bits and pieces definitely add up, right? So while I wish I had more to say about what I'm doing, I'm going to condense down the time lapse to show off a little bit of everything, leave you with some music, and I'll be back in a bit. The tattoos were another tedious part, and I had to look at so many different reference images just to get the full view of all the designs on the side and the back and her shoulders and such. Because again, details and accuracy are super important to me. And I know in the end result they aren't exact, but I think I got them pretty close. It was at this point that I just kind of stopped recording most of the process. The bulk of the creation was all done, all the modeling and texturing, and it was just small tweaks and adjustments here and there, so I didn't really bother. I then moved on to the rigging, and some of that I did actually record, though I did say last time that I'm not as comfortable showing my rigging process as I am with everything else, and that's still the case. Her hair was the main elements to add bones to, of course, which is split up into 4 different strands for the fringe, 2 main plaits, and then there's the extra one for the tiny strands in her fringe as well. I also added a couple extra bones to add physics to later, like her overall straps, and there are some in her shoelaces as well, even though you never see them. I made the mistake of trying to cut corners a little bit and make my life easier by doing automatic weights when parenting. I ended up just repainting them all manually anyways, and it just added more work for me. I start out really rough to kind of block out the weights first. So bone 1 goes from 100, deselect some, set to 50, set bone 2 to 50, deselect and weight 100, back to bone 1 and set it to 0, and just repeat the process. Hopefully that'll make sense as you're watching me in the background, because reading this from my script, I'm lost. But what ends up happening is that each bone will have a group of vertices being 100%, and then there's a loop or 2 of vertices between each one that are set to 50 for both groups, and you've got a really rough transition. And once it's all blocked in very roughly, I just select them all and smooth them out, both because I am lazy, but also if it works, it works. I probably could go even more rough with it, just with 100% and 0% weights and skip the 50% mix in between and just have a higher smoothing rate, but that's something I'll have to try out next time. The very last step, at least in Blender, before hopping over into Unity, is the blend shapes. The light at the end of the tunnel, but still a bit more work for me yet. While regular rigging and weights moves the model with bones, the facial expressions are all done using what's called blend shapes. Essentially, you have a slider from 0 to 100, and different triggers will have an effect on these sliders, like eyebrows moving, the mouth moving when talking, etc. Vtuber Studio also has expression blend shapes with presets expressions like joy, anger, sorrow, and these can be bound to a hotkey, or a VTubing program can be trained to read these expressions on your face and trigger the blend shape. Now with Jinx, I made a lot of changes to the face shape and all of the features, so I had to go through all of the pre-made blend shapes and fix them up to match the new face shape. A lot of these I may never actually use, but since they were already there, it was a simple thing to fix them up. I'm just selecting all of the vertices that aren't part of the blend shape and transferring the new base vertices. That way I don't have to redo them all from scratch. Also, a new thing that I've recently done to my main VTuber before finishing Jinx was creating the 52 AR kit blend shapes. The AR kit blend shapes, they're very specific blend shapes, and there's 52 of them. It means I can use a program on my phone to read my facial expression in augmented reality and have a wider variety of what my face can do. And this is commonly used with iFacial mocap because Apple uses Face ID to get a really smooth tracking for all of the different points in your face. I have an Android, but Meowface is the program that I use to do pretty much the same thing, though it is a bit more rough around the edges because of the technology. It means I can squint, I can raise my eyebrows, I can move my mouth side to side, I can purse my lips, I can even screw my nose up. I think that's working. It's supposed to be, but anyway. And there's all of these different individual blend shapes to control that. Like I said, 52 of them, but it means that there's a lot of fine-tuning tracking that can happen. And so to wrap up, this is the end result. I've learned a lot, and there's some things that I definitely won't be doing again, and as usual, I've got some things to improve on and experiment for next time. At the time of me doing this voiceover, I'm already partway through making a new model. If you're interested in checking it out at all, I do stream over on Twitch most of the process, so it's also a chance to ask questions in real time. But that's all from me for now for this video. I hope you enjoyed and even learned something, or at least got an insight into my process and maybe even some inspiration. But either way, thanks for watching, and I'll see you the next one.